Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. Today's episode represents a new chapter. This one promises to be a little longer than the 5 episodes of Chapter 3. This is an exciting time period, much of which took place at or around the time of the Antinomian controversy, mid-1630s. In this chapter, the next several episodes, we will develop the background or the lead-up through the immediate consequence of the Pequot War. And this was a big deal to the folks back then, and it's a big deal to our storyline as well. The Pequot War represents that left side of the bookend of the larger time frame that began in the 1630s and ran until the 1670s through King Philip's War. That's kind of our right-sided bookend if you're looking at this chronologically. It's a period when Massachusetts consolidated power and influence and reigned supreme over the other English colonies, when the English wrested the land from the natives of New England, during the time of not only the 30 Years' War, but the English Civil War, the days of Cromwell and Charles I and Charles II, the times of the regicides, the rise of French competition and the dismantling of the Dutch, the rise of mercantilism, and the potential use of national military for economic gain. There's a lot going on, a lot that was about to happen. I feel like up until this point, I've been pedaling up a hill for quite a while, and I'm just about at the crest of the hill and about to go down the other side. And I want to pedal faster and faster. This is one of my favorite time frames that we're going to talk about throughout the history of this podcast. The trick will be for me to stay on task, in my lane, so to speak, and continue to develop the colonial narrative that we're driving for, and that is colonial unity and native contributions. So anyways, there's a lot of moving parts to this conflict, and the narrative will move pretty fast once we get there. So I want to take a couple of episodes and develop a few of the prominent figures that we'll be introduced to, as well as introducing a wider discussion about New Hampshire and Maine, because we're going to be taking a closer look at them just after the Pequot War. To get to this point, we spent Chapter 3, the last 5 episodes, developing the mindset of the Bible state, Massachusetts Bay. The controversies of Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson were developed enough to understand the larger arguments of freedom of conscience and religion and the role of secular government. And these controversies had a twofold effect. The first one is the tightening of the grip on Puritanism in Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth, what that looked like practically, the maintenance of Puritanism. The implications of Puritan dominance would be felt for generations. And secondly, the expansion of colonialism and settlement, even Puritanism, or at least its theological influence, into modern Rhode Island. Well, Rhode Island took center stage. Puritanism also expanded into New Hampshire. You remember John Wheelwright's flight during the Antinomian controversy. In our last chapter, New Hampshire was really just a footnote. And today, we want to move that footnote kind of to center stage, but largely through the lens of one man's life. And in doing so, we'll fill out the atmosphere around the settlement of both Maine and New Hampshire, which will be very useful in future episodes. Now, the immediate plan is that over the next few episodes, we'll come to understand New Hampshire as a unique colony, a non-Puritan colony that played an important part in the continuing narrative of English colonization. New Hampshire was not necessarily settled by men from the east or the south, but by men who approached from the north. And we'll add another layer to that transparency that we've been building on for quite a while now. And looking just a little farther out, the plan is to set us up for the larger storyline of the Pequot War by looking at 4 men, 4 Englishmen that were there in the New England region, 3 of which were trained military men, hired for colonial service, much like Miles Standish had been for Plymouth. They were his contemporaries and had similar backgrounds, but they're going to come just a little bit later. The 4th person we'll meet today. He was also a military guy, but his service was different. His activity and station in New England was different. So enough of the intro. Let's talk about New Hampshire. New Hampshire was the most northern of the 13 original New England colonies. As far as exploration and colonization, like many areas in this region, the Vikings are believed to have been the first Europeans in New Hampshire. But exploration and colonization, for our purposes, the English colonization, began much later. The real story begins in 1603 with Martin Pring. Pring was a young 23-year-old captain from Bristol who was all over the New England region making assessments for future commercial ventures in areas that now include Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. We may never speak of him again in this series, so history's footnote had just become ours. And in 1605, Samuel de Champlain, the famous French explorer, was in the area as well. And we've made mention of him in a prior episode, and we'll be talking about him more in the future. There's one more honorable mention here for now. Captain John Smith was in the area in 1614. He's another character that we'll definitely be talking about in the future, especially as we move south to Virginia and Jamestown, probably a few months from now. Smith's contribution here up north included mapping the coastline and visiting the Isle of Shoals in New Hampshire. And of this area, he was noted as saying, quote, "Here should be no landlords to rack us with high rents, or extorted fines to consume us. Here every man may be a master of his own labor and land in a short time. The sea there is the strangest pond I ever saw. What sport doth yield a more pleasant context and less hurt or charge than angling with a hook and crossing the sweet air from isle to isle over the silent streams of a calm sea." End quote. There's 3 points about this quote that struck me as soon as I read it. And the first one is, that's a classic American attitude very early on, isn't it? So recognizable. I mean, in one word, it's bravado. Maybe in 2 words, rugged individualism. Or maybe it's just anti-establishment individualism. The second thing that struck me was what he said was actually pretty brave. I mean, it's treasonous. You remember the concept of colonialism was to benefit the mother country first, then the sending organization or the investors. And thirdly, this is not only a very different attitude than the Puritans to come, but it's also different than the men who would come before the Puritans, the counter-Puritans, of whom we'll be speaking about the next few weeks. So as far as the English are concerned, Martin Pring and later John Smith found that the waters off New Hampshire's coast provided excellent fishing, and that was the impetus for settlement. One of the first land grants went to a fisherman named David Thompson. His colony was called Panaway. Later, it came to be known as Rye. It was complete with salt-drying fish racks and a storehouse. And there were other towns and settlements and plantations that sprang up in the area. You remember it was New Hampshire, Exeter, in 1638 that the Reverend John Wheelwright fled to when he found himself on the wrong side of the antinomian controversy and the Puritan leadership in Boston. Now, that said, it's noteworthy to mention that New Hampshire, unlike many of the New England colonies, was not a targeted religious colony, but rather commercial. In the 1640s, they would be both excluded from the United Colonies, a Puritan defense pact, and ultimately dominated by Boston, like everybody else. So how did New Hampshire develop, or rather, who developed New Hampshire? Who gets the credit? We've already dropped a lot of names, but the man given the credit for founding New Hampshire is John Mason. Now, there's a word of caution here. There will be 2 John Masons in our current sub-series. There's John Mason, New Hampshire extraordinaire. We'll call him Governor John Mason. And there will be a John Mason, the professional soldier turned mercenary for hire. We're going to call him Captain John Mason. 2 different men who were both influential in their own right, whose lives and activity in the New World slightly overlapped. I mean, frankly, by the time Captain John Mason's primary contribution took place, Governor John Mason had already passed from the scene. The other 2 biographical sketches in the next few weeks will be Lyon Gardner and John Underhill. So we'll look at John Mason, the governor, today and follow that up with studies on the other 3. And I want to keep those 3 grouped together in our consideration because they were so similar. Again, these guys were really mercenaries, guns for hire in the New World. They had been trained, experienced military men in Europe, brought over by various colonial groups in much the same fashion as their contemporary Miles Standish had been by the Pilgrims of Plymouth. Their roles were to be the trainers and protectors of the colony or men who bought their services. And in these examples, they became much more. Their roles intersected and intertwined in 1636 and 1637. Now, I will warn you before we get there, they left behind challenging legacies, both within the English colonial structure and outside of it. But make no mistake, they cleared the way for English dominance. I mean, Sherman's total war over 2 centuries later would have nothing on these guys. Their direct influence and participation affected almost every major event in almost every colony for years. So anyway, Governor John Mason, who was he? Where did he come from? Who did he know? What did he do? How did he come to be involved with New Hampshire? We'll answer these questions over the next couple of weeks. He's got an interesting tale to tell. John Mason was born in 1586 in Kingsland, Norfolk, England. He was from a well-to-do family and was well-educated. He attended both Peterhouse College, Cambridge, and Magdalen College, Oxford. His studies included navigation, astronomy, cartography, mathematics, and seamanship. Now, at this time, when he was going to college, his address was listed as Southampton County, which included the town of Portsmouth. But he was married in his hometown, and his wedding took place at King's Lynn in 1606, and his wife's name was Anne Green. And this may have been where he joined the Navy of King James I. I mean, no doubt he was influenced and inspired as a youth by the exploits of such national heroes as Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh and Henry Hudson. I mean, who knew his future would take such a similar path, even eclipsing these men in many ways? It was 1610 when John Mason began to leave his mark. Many of his exploits were well documented. At this time, the 24-year-old was dispatched by the king with the rank of captain on an expedition that included 2 warships and 2 pinnaces, or support vessels, to assist the Bishop of Isles, Andrew Knox, in establishing ecclesiastical authority over the people of the Hebrides, a group of islands located off the western coast of Scotland. In an arrangement that would appear altogether odd in our times, Mason agreed to finance the expedition out of his own pocket. No one's really sure where that money came from. It was supposed to be paid back later, though. He was supposed to be reimbursed by the Treasurer of Scotland, the Earl of Dunbar. Now, he may have actually been tapped for this task because he was the only one willing or able to fund the 2,000 pounds that it was going to take. Military distinction was a great way to climb the social and the political ladder in those days, so it made sense. The trip lasted 14 months, and in that time, the expenses had totaled 2,238 pounds. But also, in that time, the Earl of Dunbar had died, and the struggle for reimbursement would continue for decades. What he did receive from the Scottish Privy Council was the assize of herring in the northern seas. I mean, basically, he was in charge of the herring industry, fishing. That could have been lucrative, but it appears that he was only in charge on paper or by edict. There does not appear to have been any teeth on enforcement. The Dutch fishermen in the area simply wouldn't pay him. And worse yet, the Scottish fishermen had him imprisoned. And this only added insult to injury for John Mason. But I can't help but think about all of the politics this involves. I mean, let's consider this injustice, which I think it was. I mean, he was clearly not being compensated or reimbursed for his expenses on a job that had been completed and a mission that had been accomplished. So the politics of this scenario, which I want to work through using only relationships, situations, and concepts that we've already worked through together over the last 6 months in this podcast series. So let's apply some rationale to the world that they lived in. First, let's remember that politics and diplomacy are messy. I do not know which, if any of these situations contributed to the ill attention that Mason received from the authorities that had sanctioned and benefited from his service. But to me, they're all more than plausible. So let's flesh this out a little bit. You remember the Dutch and the English had a special relationship concerning their mutual and perpetual threat from Spain, and frankly, from Catholicism in general. And they had helped each other for years. Elizabeth had stationed troops in the Netherlands for decades as an added defense against Spanish aggression, and she had financed German mercenaries on their behalf as well. And the Dutch, for their part, had played roles, minor as they may have turned out to be, in both the Spanish and the English armadas. And they were at this time harboring the Pilgrims at Leyden. But both countries were also vying for a piece of the colonial pie. They were building their own empires. Nothing on the national scale for either society was going to be allowed to interfere with the main objective, and that was empire building. The Dutch were already everywhere, challenging the Spanish, and competition was heating up with the English for footholds everywhere. So in the grand scheme of things, it was probably not in either nation's best interest to push too hard on this front. Mason was on his own. He had an edict with no teeth. And the Scottish angle presented, to me, potentially a bigger problem or a more interesting problem. At this point, we're less than a decade into the United Kingdom of Scotland and England. It's a brokered peace that had been decades in the making. A brokered peace that had begun at least as far back as Henry VIII. And with Elizabeth's death, the Tudor dynasty had given way to the Stuarts. And James of Scotland became the monarch of the United Kingdom. But centuries of tension, not to mention the whole religious angle, were not going to be marginalized just because some nobles and aristocrats said it was. There had been tension, and there would be a lot more tension to come. In this tension, you had not only national pride, but that nasty three-way power struggle between the Protestants, the Catholics, and the Anglicans. Decades later, these factions would all have skin in the game that was to be the English Civil War. The Scottish Privy Council may have been Scottish, but they were in place to advise the Crown. And by Crown, we mean their own Scottish guy, James. The fact that they approved this measure does not mean they felt any responsibility toward it. And it certainly doesn't mean the common folk did. That's not unusual, right? It appears to be a fairly common thing among men that the represented folks that have to live under the decisions of their representatives don't always necessarily agree with said representatives. So again, the Privy Council was not actually there for common folks' benefit anyways, but for the Crown. You see the plethora of diplomatic issues and tensions here. It sucks to be John Mason, but the bigger picture for all concerned parties seems to tell the tale. So at any rate, John Mason, acting on behalf of the Crown, with the promise of reimbursement from the Treasurer of Scotland, had done his duty and succeeded in his assignment. And for that he received no reimbursement. A toothless, unenforceable position, humiliation, imprisonment by what were now, at least supposedly, his own countrymen. I don't know. Maybe the Privy Council's hands were tied. Maybe they tried to help him the best that they could. Maybe they just wanted to get rid of John Mason. Here's some authority, go away. Stop asking us for money. Do with your power what you will. In any event, and for whatever reason, the forces that had been in any of these varying factors, the assize was unenforceable and the office failed. And I've found often, upon considering this outrage or that malfeasance, that there are generally many other factors to consider. These types of things are much more multifaceted than they are presented. That's why each side bitterly clings to their position. They all seem to have some merit. One's position oftentimes seems to be based on where one's benefit comes from. Laws, fairness, reasonable expectation be damned. Yep, politics and diplomacy are messy. Now, at this point, John Mason had to be mad. I would be. From a distance, it looks like he was either played all along or he simply became expendable along the way. What started out as an opportunity, an investment for future advancement, ended with a personal debt that would not be repaid. He's lost money and time, but he seems to have emerged as ambitious as ever and experienced. John Mason was capable and willing, and he was also a pragmatist. He was going to use his capabilities and ambitions one way or another. So, in my imagination at least, drawing from the national heroes of his youth, Mason turned to piracy. Really, most of us are only one or two disappointments away, disappointments of the right kind, from turning rebel ourselves. So working out of the tiny Isle of Rona off the west coast of Scotland, he targeted vessels between Scotland and Norway. Now, he was eventually caught and prosecuted in August of 1615, and he forfeited virtually everything, ships, booty, you name it. So again, he's out of everything. I wonder what would have happened had they simply reimbursed him for his previous service. It's at this time that things started to actually turn around. John Mason took his ambition and his experience. The John Mason that had been a naval commander and now a pirate. The educated John Mason, a young man with considerable intelligence and talent. He who still was not broken was introduced to Sir William Alexander, who would become the Earl of Stirling. And it was Alexander that knew of just the opportunity that would suit John Mason. There was a colony in Newfoundland that had been founded in 1610 when the king issued a charter to develop plantations. And the original governor, John Guy, had resigned. The Newfoundland Company appointed Mason as governor. Yep, a lot of his service would be in modern Canada. That was his ticket to the New World. When you think about it, he must have had real appeal to the company. His background was just what they needed. He had influential friends. He was well educated. He had been a naval commander and a pirate. They not only needed a governor, they needed somebody to stave off the constant pirate attacks on the island. So by June of 1616, John Mason was at Cooper's Cove. This was a great time for John Mason, and he set to work personally surveying the island. He produced not only the first known English map of Newfoundland, but also accurately described the geography and climate. He described the plants and the vegetation and natural resources, all of which would be published in 1620 on a trip to London in a book entitled, quote, A Brief Discourse of the Newfoundland with the Situation, Temperature, and Commodities thereof, inciting our nation to go forward in the hopeful plantation begun, end quote. That's quite a title. I mean, it's a brief discourse, but that's a long title for a brief discourse. A brief discourse of the Newfoundland with the situation, temperature, and commodities thereof, inciting our nation to go forward in the hopeful plantation begun. It's quite a title. This book also corrected previous errors about the land and helped to encourage more settlers. They were convinced by the book of the ease and profitability of relocation to Newfoundland. It appears Mason was flourishing. In August 1617, in a letter to his friend, Sir John Scott, he stated, quote, As housewives have many lets to good housewifery, frontlets, bracelets, partlets, etc., so I have inlets, outlets, bays, coves, and through their discovery been so many obstacles and hindrances to my duties. His map appeared in 1625 as part of William Vaughan's Cambrensium Carolia, and again in 1626 in a book entitled The Golden Fleece. Now in 1619, he returned to England to try to get the colony's patent enlarged. He wanted the colony to gain control over the visiting fishermen. And there had been some issues between the permanent settlers and the visitors. Now, personally, I can imagine how some of the fishermen would have acted. I mean, far from home and civilization, working hard for months on end. I mean, let's be honest. They're hungry and thirsty, horny, rude. I don't know. It seems like there could be friction. I mean, these outposts always seemed like they'd have been just a little lawless. Life was hard. It was dangerous, isolated. The atmosphere could, in my opinion, bring out the very best or the very worst in any man. The fishermen may have been the more desirable of the kinds of visitors that the folks were encountering, because there were pirates too. So when Mason left in October, many wondered if he planned on returning. His wife, Anne, who had been with him in the colony from the very beginning, had already left the month before. And it was at this time Mason's brief discourse was published. I mean, maybe he wasn't planning to return, but he was acting in the best interest of the colony. And frankly, he was acting in the best interest of the Crown and the United Kingdom and the nation of Scotland. It was the Scottish people that he was trying to encourage to relocate and colonize Newfoundland. The Newfoundland Company requested the Privy Council make Mason the king's lieutenant in Newfoundland to suppress the piracy. And in May of 1620, he received his commission to command a vessel to engage the pirates directly. One of the landowners, it's believed, was his old acquaintance, Sir William Alexander, the Earl of Stirling. Mason returned to Newfoundland, and this had been a successful time. The colony was doing well. The Privy Council had even granted permission for iron ore to be transported to the colony for smelting. And this may have been the high point of the colony. At any rate, Mason left in 1621 for reasons that are unknown. He had done well, but he was drawn to the south, the region that was quickly becoming known as New England. And it seems that his reputation and his friendships were paying off. Now, you remember his previous benefactor, that's my word, benefactor, Sir William Alexander. I mean, this guy's got clout, he's got land, he's got money, he's got influence. Sir William Alexander, the Earl of Stirling, was determined to settle what he called New Scotland, south of Newfoundland. That's today's Nova Scotia. That charter was secured in September of 1621. It was granted with help from the Council for New England. We've talked about them before. Their interest was farther south still. They also granted patents to John Mason and Ferdinand Gorges, who was the treasurer of the council, to develop land in the region of New England, known as Maine. And it's from this jump to the south that we begin to see John Mason's influence in what would become a territory of the United States. By this time, John Mason was a seasoned, experienced man. He had a good resume. We've spoken about Ferdinand Gorges in earlier episodes, and we've talked about the Council for New England. We'll review those a little bit later on. I mean, this is by now the early 1620s. For now, it's enough to say that Ferdinand Gorges was an influential man both in England and in the burgeoning colonies of New England. His vision was very different than that of the dissidents that were coming in the name of religious freedom. John Mason was a partner and a beneficiary of Gorges, who was quite a visionary and left quite a legacy himself. It's a great story, but that's a story for next time. And until then, I hope our time together this time has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.